King Richard the Lionheart, England's greatest hero, the symbol of chivalry, right? But what if I told you that he hated England? He spent only a few months there in his entire 10-year reign. He didn't speak English, and he showed a willingness to sell London, lock, stock, and barrel, just to finance his own personal war. While Saladin was taking Jerusalem in 1187 and Christendom was paralyzed with terror, what was Richard doing? He was warring against his own father. Known as a brilliant commander, obsessed with war for war's sake, he received the news of Jerusalem's fall as a gift. It gave this man, this Lionheart, the one thing he lacked, a holy purpose. He snatched the crown from his dying father by force, but he didn't want the crown. He wanted the cross. This is not what they tell you in history class. Today, you will find out how Richard I, upon becoming king, immediately organized a fire sale of England just to raise money for his campaign. Why his very first victory, the capture of Acre, began with a shameful quarrel with his allies that doomed the entire crusade to failure. We will dissect the truth about the massacre at Acre, why this noble knight coldly ordered the execution of 2,700 Muslim prisoners, the impossible Jerusalem, how the greatest commander of the era marched to the holy city twice and turned back twice without even looking at it, and the tragedy of the hero, how his greatest mission ended in shameful captivity and a senseless death from a teenager's arrow. This is the story of a man who proved himself a perfect warrior, but a catastrophic king. The confrontation did not become a chivalrous duel with Saladin. It turned into a dirty war, full of betrayals, logistical nightmares, and political intrigues that Richard despised. We saw this war through the eyes of the teacher, Nur-ad-Din. We saw it through the eyes of the student, Saladin. Now, we will see it through the eyes of their greatest enemy. This is the story of Richard the Lionheart, the man who won all the battles, but lost his most important war. October 187. News of the fall of Jerusalem and the catastrophe at Hattin rolled across Europe. The report plunged everyone into shock, triggering a wave of repentance and rage. In England and France, the Saladin tithe is immediately introduced, a tax to finance a new crusade. But where was Richard, Duke of Aquitaine, whom everyone considered the greatest warrior in Christendom at this moment? He was in France, and he was waging war against his 56-year-old father, King Henry II of England. Born the third son, yet the only one who inherited his father's military genius and his uncontrollable fury, Richard became the favorite of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and spent his life warring with his father over titles and lands. He was the first to take the cross after the fall of Jerusalem, but he couldn't leave. He had to claim the crown first. In 1189, in alliance with King Philip II of France, who was considered his friend but would later become his bitterest enemy, Richard backed his father into a corner. He smashed his army and forced the sick, broken Henry II to acknowledge him as heir. 2 days later, Henry II died, reportedly whispering, "Shame, shame on a conquered king." Richard became king, but England did not interest him. He immediately returned to London and began what went down in history as the greatest sell-off of the kingdom. He needed money, more money than any tax could provide. He sold everything: castles, manors, sheriff posts, ecclesiastical offices. He released the King of Scotland from his vassal oath for 10,000 marks. Chroniclers write that he openly declared, "I would have sold London itself if I could find a buyer."
His subjects did not see a king before them. They saw a military contractor liquidating his firm's assets for the biggest deal of his life. In 6 months, he gathered a fleet and an army the likes of which Europe had never seen. He forced his brother John, the future King John Lackland, to swear not to step foot in England in his absence. He thought he had secured his rear. He was wrong. So Richard's armada is ready, but he is not alone. Going on the campaign with him is his former ally and now main rival, King Philip II of France. They hate and fear each other more than they fear Saladin. They distrust each other so deeply that they decide to sail by different routes to avoid colliding at sea. In the winter of 1190, Richard's fleet is hit by a storm off the coast of Cyprus. Several of his ships are wrecked. One of them carries the most valuable cargo, Richard's sister and his fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre. The local ruler, Isaac Komnenos, who had declared himself an independent emperor, makes a fatal mistake. He captures the survivors and refuses to return them to Richard. Assuming he was dealing with an ordinary crusader rushing to the Holy Land, Isaac did not understand who Richard was. Richard refused to negotiate, and he had no desire to wait. He landed his army and conquered the entire island in 3 weeks. He captured Isaac, bound him in silver chains, for he had promised not to clap him in irons, and took his treasury. He was late to the Holy Land, but he arrived there possessing a new, rich naval base and a reputation as a man who conquers countries on the way. In June 1191, he arrived under the walls of Acre, and it was there that the first conflict awaited him, one that would decide the fate of the entire crusade.
June 1191. Richard arrives at the Crusader camp outside Acre, where he instantly encounters hatred. He was late. King Philip II of France, his main rival, had arrived earlier and was already leading the siege. The army turned out to be exhausted, the camp suffering from disease. Richard delivered not just soldiers, he provided money, supplied giant siege engines, and most importantly, revealed his reputation. The soldiers hailed him as a savior, which caused burning envy in Philip. And then Richard made his first fatal political mistake. After one of the assaults, when the walls fell, Duke Leopold V of Austria hoisted his banner on a tower alongside Richard's banner. Richard, who considered the Duke a servant and not an equal to a king, flew into a rage. His men, or he himself, tore down the Austrian flag and threw it into the moat. He publicly humiliated one of his main allies. Leopold harbored a mortal grudge. However, on the field of battle, he knew no equal. Under his pressure, on July 12, 1191, the garrison of Acre surrendered. The terms were standard. Saladin was to pay a huge ransom, return 1,500 Christian prisoners, and most importantly, return the true cross captured at Hattin. Until then, the garrison of Acre, 2,700 soldiers, as well as their wives and children, remained Richard's hostages. Saladin began to haggle. He delayed payments, trying to drive down the price, not believing that the knight Richard would kill the defenseless. He didn't know Richard. On August 20, Richard realized Saladin was stalling for time. The hostages were a burden. They were eating supplies. They needed to be guarded, which tied down his army. He could not move on Jerusalem, dragging 3,000 prisoners behind him. He made a decision, not as a knight, but as a ruthless tactician. He ordered all 2,700 prisoners led out beyond the city walls in full view of Saladin's army stationed on the nearby hills, and coldly executed every single one.
the driving force was not rage, but cold calculation. The brutal act served as a signal to Saladin. I am not playing your games. I came to wage war. The massacre at Acre split the Third Crusade. King Philip of France, shocked or simply envious of Richard's cruelty and glory, announced that he was ill. He took his army and sailed home to France. Having sworn to Richard not to attack his lands, he would break that oath as soon as he stepped on shore. Duke Leopold of Austria also left, taking with him a thirst for vengeance. Richard was left alone. He had achieved victory, but lost all his allies. Now he was the sole leader of the crusade, and he had to move. His goal, Jaffa, the port that served as the key to Jerusalem. But between him and Jaffa lay a 100-kilometer march along the coast, and on the hills, like a shadow, Saladin's entire army tracked him. Saladin was furious about the massacre at Acre and thirst for revenge. He intended to apply the same tactic that brought him victory at Hattin. Wear down the enemy with archers, cut them off from water, attack the supply trains, and wait for the enemy to break under the sun. He prepared a trap near the town of Arsuf, but he didn't account for one thing. He wasn't going up against Guy of Lusignan. He was going up against the greatest tactician of the West.
The march from Acre to Jaffa became Richard's tactical masterpiece. He knew that Saladin would use the tactics of Hattin, and he developed the perfect antidote. By his order, the army began to move in close order formation. To the right, by the sea, sailed the fleet, supplying the army with water and provisions, denying Saladin the use of thirst as a weapon. To the left, facing the enemy, marched the infantry, crossbowmen and spearmen, forming a living wall. And in the center, like a coiled spring, marched the knights. Richard issued an iron command: no one attacks without his personal signal. On September 7th, 1191, near the town of Arsuf, Saladin decided the time had come. He threw everything he had at Richard's army. Tens of thousands of mounted archers circled the column for hours, showering it with arrows. Dust, screams, heat. The Crusader army marched, bleeding, but held the line. The Hospitallers, marching in the rear guard, suffered most of all. Saladin threw his best forces at them. The Hospitallers were on the brink of breaking. They begged Richard to give the signal to attack. But Richard waited. He waited until Saladin, believing in his victory, committed his heavy cavalry too close. He waited until the enemy lost their order. At one moment, the master of the Hospitallers could take no more. Violating orders, he and one other knight broke rank and rushed at the enemy. Did Saladin's trap snap shut? No. Richard realized the moment had arrived. He didn't punish the rule breakers. He led the charge. He ordered the trumpets to sound, and the entire line of heavy cavalry, which he had held in reserve like a compressed spring, wheeled around and slammed into the Muslim army. The effect was devastating. Saladin did not expect such a coordinated, massive strike. His army, unaccustomed to a frontal charge by European knights, was crushed, scattered, and fled the battlefield. The battle turned into the first and only major defeat of Saladin in the open field. Richard the Lionheart proved that he was a genius of tactics and that an army under his command was invincible. Victory at Arsuf opened the road for Richard. A few days later, he entered Jaffa and immediately began restoring its fortifications. He was one day's journey from his main goal. Saladin was beaten, but not broken. He realized he could not defeat this king in open battle, so he applied a new tactic, the tactic of scorched earth. He ordered the systematic destruction of Ascalon, the pearl of the coast,
a fortress capable of becoming the ideal base for Richard. He destroyed everything he could. And Richard got stuck. He was forced to spend precious winter months on the restoration of Ascalon. His army, consisting of mercenaries and feudal lords, began to grumble. They didn't come to haul stones, they came to liberate Jerusalem. Richard found himself in a trap. He remained a genius warrior. He showed himself to be a terrible politician and logistician. Nevertheless, by the summer of 1192, he was ready. He gathered the army and moved toward the holy city. He approached so close that his vanguard could see the walls of Jerusalem. In panic, Saladin was preparing the city for a desperate defense. Victory seemed imminent, and at that moment, Richard gave an order: retreat. Summer 1192. Richard stands at Beit Nuba, just 12 miles from Jerusalem. He sees the towers of the holy city on the horizon. Inside Jerusalem itself, according to chroniclers, there is panic. Saladin, realizing his army cannot withstand a storming, prepares the city for evacuation. Victory was right there. It could have been taken. And Richard calls a council of war and announces his decision. They are retreating. His generals were furious. Soldiers who believed they were marching to a holy assault wept with disappointment. How? Why? Here lies the key moment, because at this moment, Richard the warrior gave way to Richard the strategist. He realized the brutal, cold truth we have already mentioned. To take Jerusalem does not mean to hold it. His army was an army of crusade, not of occupation. As soon as they took the city and the Holy Sepulchre, most pilgrims would consider their duty fulfilled and sail home. He would remain with a handful of knights in a city surrounded by Saladin's empire. Saladin, having lost the city, would simply cut the supply lines from the coast. Richard and his garrison would die of starvation in 3 months. The city would turn into a trap. There was a second reason as well. While he was here in Palestine, a knife was being driven into his back. He was receiving letters from England. His brother John Lackland, was trying to seize his throne, and his former ally, King Philip of France, was already busy plundering his lands in Normandy. Richard realized he could conquer Jerusalem but lose England, and he made the hardest decision of his life. He turned away from Jerusalem. Legend says he covered his face with his shield, saying he was unworthy to see the city he could not liberate. He retreated to the coast. His holy crusade had failed. Richard's retreat from the walls of Jerusalem was a signal to Saladin. The Sultan understood: the king is broken, he is retreating, he has lost. And Saladin, as an experienced strategist, decided to strike a final, finishing blow. He wanted not just to usher Richard out, he wanted to humiliate him. He wanted to knock him out of Jaffa, the last port serving as the key to the Holy Land. While Richard was loading his ships in Acre, preparing to set sail, Saladin's army suddenly attacked Jaffa and captured the city. Only a small garrison barricaded themselves in the citadel. News of this reached Richard when he was already on his ship. Any other ruler whose mission had failed and whose throne was in danger would have given the order to raise sails. Any other, but not Richard. At that moment, the strategist in him died, and a berserker awoke. He turned his fleet around. Seeing that the port was occupied, he ordered his ship to be run aground right on the beach. And in July 1192, Richard the Lionheart, with a handful of knights, perhaps no more than 50 men, jumped waist-deep into the water and single-handedly charged Saladin's army of thousands that occupied the city. An act bordering on madness,
became his greatest act of heroism. What happened at Jaffa became the stuff of legend. Richard, leaping from the ship, was the first to storm into the city. His personal fury and reputation were so great that Saladin's soldiers, not expecting an attack from the sea, fled in panic. He retook the city with the forces of a single landing party. A few days later, Saladin, enraged by this disgrace, threw his army at Richard's camp, pitched outside the city walls. Richard had only 55 knights and about 2,000 infantrymen. Saladin had thousands. The situation foretold a massacre. But Richard personally directed the defense. He built a wall of shields and spears. Chroniclers write that he tore across the battlefield like a lion devouring its prey, and that no man could withstand his blow. Saladin, watching from a hill, was so impressed by his valor that, according to legend, he sent him a fresh horse, saying that such a king should not fight on his own 2 feet. Richard held Jaffa. He won his last, most desperate battle. Afterwards, both titans broke. Richard fell ill with fever. Saladin was completely exhausted, morally and financially. The war had reached a stalemate. In September 1192, they concluded the Treaty of Jaffa. We already know its terms. Jerusalem remained with Saladin, the coast with Richard. The cross was not returned. The crusade had failed. Richard sailed from the Holy Land in October 1192, having never seen Jerusalem. But his tragedy was just beginning. On the way back, his ship was wrecked. He had to make his way home through the lands of his bitterest enemy, Leopold of Austria, the very man whose banner he had thrown into the moat at Acre. He was recognized. He was seized and thrown into prison. The Duke of Austria and Emperor Henry VI blackmailed England, demanding a colossal ransom, 150,000 marks, 2 years' worth of income for the English crown. England, which he despised, was forced to scrape this money together to buy back a king it barely knew by sight. He returned in 1994, yet not to rule, but thirsting to wage war in France against his former friend Philip. And in 1199, this obsession with war destroyed him. In 1199, during the siege of a petty, insignificant castle, Châlons-Chabrol, he was, as was his custom, prancing near the walls without full armor. A crossbowman from the tower, legend says, a teenager, took a shot. The arrow hit him in the shoulder. The wound was not fatal. Gangrene made it fatal. After 11 days of agony, Richard the Lionheart, the greatest warrior of the era, the victor of Arsuf, died of blood poisoning.
Richard the Lionheart won every battle where he commanded personally, becoming a living god of war for all of Europe. But here is the paradox. This invincible warrior lost his main war, never having set foot in Jerusalem, and his life was cut short, not in a great battle, but by a stray arrow from a teenager during the siege of a worthless castle. Because history has proven a cruel truth. Strength alone is not enough, and in a world ruled by cunning foxes like Saladin, a direct and furious lion is always doomed to loneliness. And this lesson about the limits of military power echoes through 8 centuries to our day. But Richard was merely the finale of this drama. For long before him, there was one who could have stopped the catastrophe in its infancy, a man who was the complete opposite of Richard. He did not have the strength of a lion. His body was rotting alive, but he defeated Saladin where healthy kings surrendered. He commanded armies while chained to a litter and hid his face behind a silver mask. His name was Baldwin IV. And his history is a chronicle of the incredible victory of spirit over flesh, which the world remembers to this day. Subscribe so you don't miss that tragedy. Like if Richard's fate shocked you, and write in the comments, was he a hero or just an obsessed killer? Thank you. See you next time.